The quiet man behind the mop. A man walks into the most dangerous place on earth with nothing but a mop and bucket. Everyone assumes he's weak, disposable, invisible. But what happens when this seemingly powerless figure reveals an understanding so profound it silences the most hardened criminals? Get ready for a story that will challenge everything you think you know about strength and transformation. If this journey resonates with you, subscribe now. You won't want to miss what unfolds next. Marcus Webb pushed his cleaning cart through the steel doors of Riverside Correctional Facility on a gray Monday morning. At 53, with silver threading through his close-cropped hair and reading glasses perpetually perched on his nose, he looked more like a retired librarian than someone entering maximum security. The guards barely acknowledged him during processing. To them, he was simply another institutional worker, as permanent and unremarkable as the concrete walls themselves. The inmates noticed him differently. In their world, the hierarchy was absolute. Predators at the top, prey at the bottom. A janitor existed somewhere beneath notice, a ghost who cleaned their messes and disappeared. During his first week, Marcus heard the whispers, felt the appraising stares measuring his vulnerability. Several younger inmates made jokes loud enough for him to hear, testing whether he'd react with fear or anger. He did neither. Marcus simply cleaned. His movements were methodical, almost meditative. He mopped corridors with the same focused attention a surgeon might apply to an operation. When inmates dropped trash deliberately in his path, he picked it up without comment. When they blocked his cart, he waited patiently until they moved, meeting their challenging gazes with calm, unreactive eyes. "Look at Pops," one muscular inmate called out during rec time. "Bet he's never thrown a punch in his life." Marcus continued wringing his mop, his expression neutral. But something in his stillness made the comment fall flat. There was no fear to feed on, no anger to provoke, just presence. Solid, unshakable, and strangely compelling. By his second week, the real test came. Diego Morales, a gang enforcer serving 20 years, deliberately knocked Marcus's bucket over, sending dirty water across the freshly cleaned floor. The surrounding inmates went silent, waiting for the inevitable breakdown or confrontation. Diego stood with arms crossed, a predatory smile playing at his lips. Marcus straightened slowly, removed his glasses, cleaned them carefully with his shirt, then replaced them. He looked at Diego with an expression that wasn't anger or fear but something else entirely. A quiet, measuring assessment that seemed to see past the intimidating exterior into something deeper. "Diego Morales," Marcus said softly. "Aggravated assault, armed robbery, accessory to murder." The silence deepened. Diego's smile faltered. "How do you—" Diego started. Marcus had already turned away, refilling his bucket with the same methodical calm, leaving Diego standing there as the other inmates exchanged uncertain glances. Something had shifted, though no one could quite articulate what. Names and numbers. When a janitor begins speaking uncomfortable truths, the powerful become nervous. What knowledge does this quiet man possess, and why does it shake the foundations of prison hierarchy? Stay with this story. The revelations ahead will transform your understanding of true authority. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next chapter. The incident with Diego spread through Riverside like wildfire. By afternoon, every inmate in C Block knew the janitor had somehow identified not just Diego's name, but his crimes. In a place where reputation was currency and mystery was power, this represented a fundamental violation of unspoken rules. You didn't acknowledge what men had done outside unless they chose to tell you. The past was a locked box each man carried privately. Marcus understood the ripples his words had created. He'd known exactly what he was doing when he spoke Diego's crimes aloud. 27 years as a clinical psychologist in maximum security facilities had taught him how prison ecosystems functioned. He understood the performance of dominance, the necessity of respect, and the razor's edge between authority and victimhood. But Marcus wasn't working here as a psychologist anymore. That career had ended 18 months ago when his professional license was suspended following a bureaucratic nightmare involving patient confidentiality and departmental politics. The details were complex and ultimately unjust, but the result was absolute. Dr. Marcus Webb became Marcus Webb, Institutional janitor. Same buildings, different role, invisible to those who'd once sought his counsel. The irony wasn't lost on him. For decades, inmates had sat across from him in therapy sessions, reluctantly revealing their histories. He'd maintained strict confidentiality, building trust through professional boundaries. Now, working in the same facility under different circumstances, those boundaries no longer applied. He possessed extensive knowledge about hundreds of current inmates, their crimes, their psychological profiles, their fears and vulnerabilities. Information was power here, and Marcus held an arsenal of it. The question was whether he'd use it, and how. That evening, as Marcus cleaned the dining hall after dinner service, 3 inmates approached. They moved with the casual menace of men accustomed to getting what they wanted through implied threat. Their leader, a heavily tattooed man named Raymond Kowalski, positioned himself directly in Marcus's path. "We need to talk, old man," Raymond said, his voice carrying the false friendliness of a predator playing with prey. Marcus continued wiping down tables, his movements unhurried. "Raymond Kowalski, manslaughter, witness intimidation, parole violation." Raymond's jaw tightened. His companions shifted nervously. "I don't know what game you're playing," Raymond said, his voice harder now. "But it ends today. You don't talk about people's business, you understand?" Marcus finally looked up, meeting Raymond's eyes with that same measuring calmness. "I understand perfectly. Do you?" The response was unexpected enough that Raymond hesitated. In that hesitation, Marcus saw what he needed. Uncertainty. These men were accustomed to fear or aggression, not calm redirection. They didn't have a script for this interaction. "Your parole hearing is in 4 months, Marcus continued quietly. "You need a clean disciplinary record. Is threatening a janitor worth risking that?" Raymond's expression flickered, anger warring with calculation. Finally, he stepped back, jerking his head at his companions. They left without another word. Marcus returned to cleaning, aware that he'd just navigated the second test. There would be more. The weight of knowledge. When truth becomes a weapon, who decides how it should be wielded? A man with nothing but information begins reshaping an entire prison's power structure. What you're about to discover will challenge your assumptions about influence and transformation. Subscribe now. This journey is just beginning, and you won't want to miss what comes next. Marcus understood that his actions had initiated something irreversible. By the end of his 3rd week at Riverside, every inmate knew the quiet janitor possessed dangerous knowledge. Conversations stopped when he approached. Men watched him with a mixture of wariness and calculation, trying to determine whether he represented threat or opportunity. The administration remained oblivious. To the guards and prison officials, Marcus was exactly what his employment file indicated: an aging maintenance worker doing unremarkable labor. They didn't notice the shifting dynamics in the population, the subtle reordering of social hierarchies that occurred in his wake. Marcus maintained his routine with disciplined consistency. Morning shift began at 6, cleaning administrative offices while inmates were at breakfast. Then the cell blocks, working methodically through each tier. Afternoons meant common areas, and evenings finished in the dining hall and recreation spaces. Everywhere he went, he carried his knowledge like a second skin, invisible but present. The real change began with Marcus's deliberate choice about how to deploy what he knew. He didn't speak randomly or use information to humiliate. Instead, he intervened with surgical precision at moments when the prison's violent equilibrium threatened to tip into chaos. When 2 rival gang members began escalating toward confrontation in the yard, Marcus was mopping nearby. As tensions peaked, he quietly mentioned specific details about each man's upcoming parole hearings and the family members waiting for them outside. The personal specificity, names of children, addresses of aging parents, cut through the performance of aggression. Both men backed down, saving face by directing their attention elsewhere. When a vulnerable new inmate was being systematically targeted by predators, Marcus intervened by casually revealing the lead predator's own victimization history within earshot of others. The revelation didn't shame the predator directly, but shifted the power dynamic enough that the targeting stopped. These interventions didn't go unnoticed. Gradually, certain inmates began seeking Marcus out, not through direct approach but through strategic positioning. They'd be cleaning their cells when he came through, or sitting alone in the library when he emptied trash. They didn't ask questions directly, but their body language indicated openness to conversation. Marcus recognized these moments as invitations. Carefully, selectively, he began engaging in brief exchanges. Never therapy. He wasn't licensed for that anymore. But conversation. He'd mention books, suggest perspectives, occasionally offer observations about their situations that demonstrated he saw them as more than their crimes. "You've been writing letters," Marcus said to one young inmate named Travis, who was serving 8 years for drug trafficking. "That's good. Maintaining connections matters." Travis looked up, surprised. "How'd you know?" "Your hands. Calluses in the specific pattern that comes from gripping pens for extended periods. Also, you've been checking the mail distribution with unusual attention." Travis studied him carefully. "You notice a lot." "I pay attention," Marcus replied. "Most people don't, which is why most people miss opportunities to actually help themselves." These small interactions accumulated. Word spread that the janitor not only knew things but sometimes offered perspective worth hearing. Not advice exactly, but observations that made men think differently about their circumstances. Marcus knew he was walking a precarious line. Using his knowledge without permission violated professional ethics, yet he no longer operated under those constraints. He was in uncharted territory, creating a role that existed nowhere in prison protocol. He wasn't a guard, wasn't a counselor, wasn't an inmate. He was something else entirely, a witness with memory, moving through the institution with quiet authority born from understanding rather than force. The question was how long this could last before someone decided to eliminate the problem he represented. In prison, unprecedented situations rarely remained stable. Either they evolved into new equilibrium, or they were violently corrected. Marcus suspected the correction would come soon. The Council of Shadows. Every institution has invisible rulers who operate beyond official authority. What happens when a janitor disrupts their carefully constructed order? The confrontation ahead reveals profound truths about power and transformation. You're witnessing something extraordinary. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next. The summons came on a Thursday evening. Marcus was cleaning the library when an inmate named Carlos Mendez approached, his manner neither friendly nor hostile, but carrying the weight of official business from unofficial sources. "Someone wants to talk to you," Carlos said simply. "Tomorrow, maintenance closet near the chapel, 2 o'clock. Marcus nodded, understanding immediately. This was the response he'd been expecting. A meeting with the real power brokers who operated beneath the administration's radar. Every prison had them. The established inmates whose influence transcended gang affiliations and racial divisions. Men who'd reached accommodations with guards and administration, who controlled black markets and dispute resolution through networks built over decades. Marcus arrived at the designated time carrying his cleaning supplies, maintaining the appearance of routine labor. The maintenance closet was a small, dimly lit space that officially stored equipment, but functioned as neutral ground for sensitive conversations. Inside, 3 men waited. Julius Morrison sat on an overturned bucket, his presence commanding despite his casual posture. 61 years old, serving his 33rd year for crimes Marcus knew intimately from his psychological files. Julius had evolved from violent enforcer to elder statesman, a man who'd seen administrations and inmates cycle through while he remained constant. Beside him stood Michael Prophet Washington, whose nickname reflected his role as mediator and advisor to multiple factions. And leaning against the wall was Vincent Delacroix, the quiet strategist who orchestrated commissary distribution and information flow. "Dr. Webb," Julius said, acknowledging Marcus's former title deliberately. "Or should I say Marcus the janitor?" Marcus set down his mop bucket. "Marcus works fine. I'm not a doctor here." "But you were," Prophet interjected. "You know things about nearly everyone in this facility. That makes people nervous." "It makes you nervous," Marcus corrected gently. "Most inmates don't know I was the staff psychologist before I took this position. They just know I have information." Vincent spoke for the first time, his voice soft but penetrating. "Information is power. Power without accountability is chaos. You're disrupting established order." Marcus had anticipated this accusation. "I'm preventing violence." Every intervention I've made has stopped potential incidents that would have triggered lockdowns and disrupted everyone's routines. Without authorization, Julius said, without asking permission from those who maintain the actual peace here. The truth of prison hierarchy lay bare in that statement. Official rules were one system, but survival required parallel structures that operated through negotiated consent among the incarcerated population. Marcus had bypassed those structures, acting unilaterally based on his own judgment. "You're right," Marcus acknowledged. "I should have established communication first." "That's why I'm glad we're talking now." Prophet studied him carefully. "You're not afraid." "Why?" "Because you're not going to hurt me," Marcus replied with quiet certainty. "Violence against me creates more problems than it solves. Administration would investigate, which increases scrutiny on everyone. And you're curious about whether I might actually be useful." The three men exchanged glances, a silent communication Marcus recognized from countless group therapy sessions. They were reassessing, considering possibilities they hadn't fully explored. "What do you want?" Vincent asked finally. "Same thing you do," Marcus said. "A stable environment where people can serve their time with minimal additional trauma. I just have different tools for achieving it." Julius leaned forward slightly. "Tools that include everyone's darkest secrets." "Tools that include understanding," Marcus corrected. "Yes, I know details about people's crimes and psychological histories, but I also understand rehabilitation, trauma, and the human capacity for change. If we work together instead of at cross purposes, we could actually improve conditions here." "Improve conditions," Prophet repeated skeptically. "The administration has been trying that for decades." "The administration doesn't have what I have," Marcus said. "And they don't have what you have, actual influence over daily life here. Together, those might add up to something meaningful." The silence stretched as the three men considered his proposal. Finally, Julius spoke. "We don't give you permission to use what you know freely. But we won't stop you either, provided you consult with us before making interventions that affect major players or could trigger wider conflicts. You want to help some kid avoid becoming prey? Fine. You want to defuse a situation between tier bosses? You talk to us first." It was more than Marcus had hoped for, not endorsement, but accommodation. Room to operate within negotiated boundaries. "That works," Marcus agreed. "One more thing," Vincent added. "You ever use what you know about us personally, this arrangement ends. Immediately." Marcus met each man's eyes in turn. "I'm not here to leverage anyone. I'm here to do the job I couldn't do officially anymore." Prophet smiled slightly. "You're still doing therapy, just without the office." "Maybe," Marcus conceded. "But now I'm doing it with a mop." The young wolf's test institutional change begins with individual moments that seem insignificant but ripple through entire communities. Watch what happens when understanding meets aggression, when wisdom faces raw anger. This chapter reveals transformation's true beginning. Subscribe now so you don't miss how one confrontation changes everything. Marcus understood that his arrangement with Julius, Prophet, and Vincent provided operating space but not universal acceptance. Many inmates still viewed him with suspicion, or saw his knowledge as threat rather than resource. The real test of his new role would come from someone with nothing to lose and everything to prove. That person arrived in the form of Jackson Riley, a 23-year-old transferred from another facility with a jacket full of assault charges and disciplinary violations. Jackson was what corrections officers called a problem inmate. Intelligent, angry, and committed to establishing dominance through violence. Within his first week at Riverside, he'd already orchestrated 2 fights and intimidated several weaker inmates into becoming his servants. Marcus first encountered Jackson in the dining hall during evening cleanup. The young man sat alone at a table Marcus needed to wipe down, his posture radiating aggressive territoriality. When Marcus approached with his cleaning supplies, Jackson didn't move. "Table's closed," Jackson said flatly. Marcus stopped a respectful distance away. "I need to clean it before lights out. Sanitation requirements." "Sanitation requirements," Jackson mimicked mockingly. "Old man, I don't care about your requirements. Find another table." Other inmates had stopped eating, Watching the confrontation with the focused attention spectators always brought to potential violence. Marcus felt the weight of their observation. This moment would define whether his quiet authority could withstand direct challenge from someone genuinely dangerous. "Jackson Riley," Marcus said calmly. "Aggravated assault on a correctional officer. Assault with a deadly weapon. Possession with intent to distribute. Multiple institutional violations resulting in extended sentence." Jackson's expression darkened. He stood slowly, his 6'3" frame deliberately intimidating. "You want to repeat that, old man?" "I don't need to repeat it," Marcus replied. "You heard me clearly. What you need to decide is whether escalating this situation serves your interests. You're already facing additional charges from your last facility. Violence against staff here means automatic transfer to administrative segregation and further extensions to your sentence. Is cleaning a table worth another 2 years? Jackson moved closer, entering Marcus's personal space. A classic dominance maneuver. Up close, Marcus could see the calculation behind the anger, the intelligence Jackson tried to hide beneath street aggression. "You think knowing my charges protects you?" Jackson asked softly. "Everyone here knows everyone's business eventually. Doesn't mean anything." "You're right," Marcus agreed. "Knowing your crimes doesn't protect me, but understanding why you commit them, that might help both of us." Jackson blinked, momentarily thrown by the unexpected response. "You were 16 when your brother was killed in gang crossfire," Marcus continued, his voice pitched low enough that only Jackson could hear. "You joined the same gang seeking revenge, escalated into dealing to fund operations, and assaulted the correctional officer who you believed disrespected your brother's memory during intake questioning. Everything you've done since then has been about loyalty to someone who's dead, and anger at a world that took him from you." Jackson's jaw clenched. "You don't know anything about my brother." "I know loss," Marcus said simply. "I know what rage feels like when it has nowhere constructive to go. And I know that right now, in this moment, you're deciding whether I'm an enemy who needs to be eliminated or something else entirely." The silence between them stretched. Around them, the dining hall remained suspended, waiting. Finally, Jackson stepped back. Not surrender, but recalibration. "Clean your table, old man." He walked away, leaving Marcus to his work. But something had shifted. Not resolution, but acknowledgement. Jackson had chosen not to escalate, and in prison, that choice mattered profoundly. Later that evening, as Marcus emptied trash in the cell block, he found Jackson waiting near his cell. The young man's posture was different now, less aggressive, more uncertain. "How'd you know about my brother?" Jackson asked quietly. "Your psychological evaluation from intake," Marcus answered honestly. "I was the staff psychologist before I became a janitor. I read everyone's files." "So you really do know everything?" "I know what's in the files," Marcus corrected. "What I don't know is who you might become if you stopped letting anger make your decisions." Jackson studied him for a long moment. "Why do you care?" "Because I've seen hundreds of men cycle through these facilities," Marcus said. "Some use their time to become worse versions of themselves. Others use it to become someone different. You're intelligent enough to choose which path you take." "Maybe I like who I am." "Maybe. But I don't think you like where it's leading." Jackson didn't respond, but he didn't walk away either. Marcus recognized the posture. Someone standing at a crossroads, not yet committed to either direction. "If you want to talk," Marcus said. "I'm usually cleaning the library around 8 in the evening." Quiet space, no audience. He moved on to continue his rounds, leaving Jackson to make his own choice. These moments couldn't be forced. Transformation required willingness, and willingness emerged only from internal recognition of need. But Marcus had planted the seed. Whether it would grow was up to Jackson. Fractured hierarchies. When established power structures crack, chaos threatens to emerge, or new possibilities open. Watch as an entire institution's balance shifts through unexpected alliances and dangerous revelations. What happens next will surprise you. Make sure you're subscribed to see how this transformation unfolds. The arrangement between Marcus and the prison's shadow council held for 3 weeks before complications emerged. The first crack appeared when Darius Chen, a mid-level player in the Asian gang hierarchy, accused another inmate of stealing commissary items. In normal circumstances, such disputes were resolved through the established networks. Profit would mediate, compensation would be arranged, and balance would be restored. But Darius demanded public punishment, insisting the thief be beaten as demonstration to others. The thief, a young man named Anthony Santos, had no gang protection and faced brutal consequences unless someone intervened. Marcus learned of the situation during afternoon rounds when he overheard two inmates discussing the scheduled lesson planned for rec time. He immediately sought out Profit, finding him in the chapel where he regularly spent contemplative hours. "Anthony Santos," Marcus said without preamble. "Darius is planning to make an example of him today." Profit looked up from his Bible, unsurprised. "Darius claims Anthony stole from him. Can't let that slide without response." "Anthony didn't steal anything," Marcus said. "He borrowed money from Darius 2 weeks ago and paid it back with interest. Darius is manufacturing the theft accusation to establish dominance because his standing with his own gang is slipping." Profit's expression sharpened. "How do you know that?" "Because I pay attention. Darius has been losing respect among younger Asian inmates who see him as too accommodating to other factions. He needs a victory to reassert himself, and Anthony is vulnerable." "If that's true," Profit said slowly, "then preventing this punishment might destabilize the entire Asian faction. They'll see it as disrespect. But allowing it creates precedent for false accusations and arbitrary violence," Marcus countered. "That destabilizes everything." They sat in silence, weighing consequences. Finally, Profit spoke. "What's your play?" "Let me talk to Darius. If I can demonstrate publicly that his accusation is false without humiliating him directly, he can back down while saving face." Profit considered this. "You have evidence?" "I have understanding of timelines and transactions, and I have knowledge of why he's really doing this. Risky. If you're wrong, or if Darius doesn't accept the out you're giving him, this gets messy." "Messier than beating an innocent man?" Profit smiled slightly. "You really are still doing therapy, just without the license." Marcus found Darius in the yard during free time, surrounded by his associates in a calculated display of power. Anthony stood 20 feet away, isolated and fearful, aware his scheduled punishment loomed. "Darius Chen," Marcus said, approaching with his customary calm. "May I speak with you?" The surrounding inmates tensed, but Darius gestured permissively. "The janitor has something to say." "I understand there's a dispute about commissary items," Marcus began carefully. "Before this proceeds, I want to share some observations." "Observations?" Darius's tone carried warning. "This is settled business." "Is it?" Marcus asked. "Because my understanding is that Anthony borrowed money, paid it back, and is now being accused of theft. That's not business. That's false accusation." Darius's eyes hardened. "You calling me a liar?" "I'm calling you strategic," Marcus replied. "You need to demonstrate strength because your position within your own faction has weakened recently. Making an example of someone vulnerable accomplishes that. But it also establishes precedent where anyone can be accused falsely when someone needs a public victory. That precedent affects everyone, including you eventually." The yard had gone quiet. Other inmates sensed something significant unfolding. "What I'm offering," Marcus continued, "is a different path. You can verify Anthony's payments through commissary records if you choose. When those records prove he fulfilled his debt, you can acknowledge the misunderstanding gracefully. That demonstrates wisdom and fairness, qualities that command respect more sustainably than fear." Darius studied Marcus with calculating intensity. "And if I refuse your offering? Then everyone here knows you punished an innocent man despite evidence to the contrary," Marcus said simply. "That's not strength. That's desperation masquerading as power." The silence stretched. Marcus had taken an enormous risk, directly challenging Darius's authority in front of witnesses, leaving no room for subtle backing down. Either Darius would accept the alternative Marcus presented, or violence would follow. Finally, Darius laughed, a sound lacking genuine humor, but providing crucial social lubricant. "The janitor thinks he runs things now." "I don't run anything," Marcus said. "I just notice things others miss." Like how Anthony's commissary account shows payment to you 12 days ago. Darius's smile faded. He hadn't expected Marcus to have specific documentation. After a long moment, he shrugged elaborately. Maybe there was confusion. Maybe someone else took my items. Anthony, we're good. The tension broke like released pressure. Anthony nearly collapsed with relief. Darius turned away, his associates following, the moment diffused but not forgotten. Marcus understood he'd just crossed a threshold. He'd directly intervened in gang business, challenged established authority, and succeeded through information and psychological leverage. That success made him more valuable and more dangerous. Prophet appeared at his elbow moments later. That was bold. That was necessary, Marcus replied. Same thing sometimes, Prophet acknowledged. But now you've shown everyone what you can do. They'll either want that power working for them, or they'll want it eliminated. Marcus nodded slowly. He'd known this moment would come, when his quiet interventions would evolve into overt influence. The question was whether the institution could absorb this new dynamic without fracturing entirely. Then I guess we find out which, Marcus said, returning to his cleaning cart as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But everyone in the yard knew better. The weight of wisdom. True authority emerges not from position, but from character tested under pressure. When a janitor becomes something more than his title, an entire institution must reckon with what leadership actually means. What you're about to witness reveals profound truths about human transformation. Stay subscribed. The most powerful moments are still ahead. The incident with Darius sent shockwaves through Riverside's social ecosystem. Within days, Marcus found himself navigating increasingly complex requests for intervention. Inmates who'd previously ignored him now sought his attention, hoping he might resolve disputes, provide insight into their situations, or simply acknowledge their existence with the same careful attention he'd shown others. The administration remained largely oblivious. To them, Marcus was still the quiet janitor who never caused problems and kept work areas immaculately clean. They didn't notice the subtle consultations happening in hallways, the brief conversations during work rotations, the way certain inmates positioned themselves to intercept Marcus during his rounds. But the guards noticed. Officer Sarah Mitchell, a 12-year veteran with sharp observational skills, cornered Marcus one morning while he cleaned the administrative corridor. Something's different, she said without preamble. Disciplinary incidents are down 30% this month. The usual conflicts aren't materializing. What's happening? Marcus continued mopping, his movements steady. Maybe people are making better choices. People don't suddenly start making better choices in prison, Mitchell countered. There's always a reason. You've been here 3 months now. The timing isn't coincidental. Marcus paused, considering his response carefully. Sarah Mitchell was intelligent and fair-minded, neither corrupt nor unnecessarily cruel. She might be an ally if approached correctly. People make better choices when they have better information, Marcus said finally. Sometimes all it takes is someone paying attention and pointing out consequences they hadn't considered. Mitchell studied him intently. You're talking to them. Not as a janitor, as something else. I'm listening to them, Marcus corrected. There's a difference. You know this could get you fired if administration finds out you're counseling inmates without authorization. I'm not counseling anyone, Marcus said honestly. I'm just observing things and occasionally sharing those observations. That's not restricted. Mitchell absorbed this distinction, recognizing its technical accuracy even as she understood its practical implications. You used to be the staff psychologist here, before the license suspension. Marcus looked at her directly, acknowledging the research she'd clearly done. I was. So you know these people. Their histories, their triggers, their vulnerabilities. I know what was in their files, Marcus agreed. What I'm learning now is who they actually are when you meet them where they live rather than across a desk in a therapy office. Mitchell leaned against the wall, crossing her arms. Look, what you're doing, whatever exactly it is, seems to be helping, but it's also precarious. You're operating in a gray zone that could get dangerous fast if the wrong people decide you're a threat. I know. So why risk it? Marcus set down his mop, giving the question the consideration it deserved. Because 27 years of sitting in an office hearing people's problems taught me how to understand them, but it didn't teach me how to actually change the environment they're trapped in. This position, paradoxically, gives me more access and flexibility than I ever had as staff. I can be present in ways professional boundaries prevented before. You're describing a completely unauthorized therapeutic program conducted by someone without a license, Mitchell said. I'm describing a janitor who listens, Marcus replied. Everything else is interpretation. Mitchell smiled slightly despite herself. You're going to drive administration crazy if they ever figure out what's happening. Only if they see it as a problem rather than an asset, Marcus suggested. Lower disciplinary incidents benefit everyone. How I contribute to that doesn't have to be officially acknowledged. They held each other's gaze for a moment, an understanding passing between them. Mitchell would watch, would observe, but wouldn't report unless something genuinely dangerous emerged. It was more than Marcus could have hoped for. One more thing, Mitchell added as she turned to leave. Jackson Riley has been in my rotation. The kid who came in hot 3 weeks ago. I know him. He's been different lately. Calmer. Still angry, but it's not driving every decision anymore. He's been reading actual books, not just gang literature. And he's been asking about GED programs. Marcus nodded slowly, feeling something unfamiliar, hope tinged with caution. Jackson had been attending their informal evening conversations in the library, saying little but listening intently. Apparently the seeds were taking root. People can change, Marcus said simply. In prison? Rarely, Mitchell countered. But maybe if someone gives them a reason to try. After she left, Marcus returned to his cleaning with renewed purpose. The conversation had clarified something important. His work was being noticed by those whose notice mattered most. The people actually paying attention to how the institution functioned rather than how it was supposed to function. That evening, Marcus found not just Jackson waiting in the library, but 3 other young inmates who'd clearly come at Jackson's invitation. They sat at a table with books open before them, the posture of students rather than criminals. We want to talk about the GED program, Jackson said without preamble. And what happens after. What's actually possible. Marcus pulled up a chair, settling into the familiar role of educator that had preceded his psychological career. Then let's talk about what's possible. But first, let's talk about what you're each willing to commit to make it real. The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours, ranging across education, rehabilitation programs, parole preparation, and the honest challenges of re-entry. Marcus didn't sugarcoat reality, but he also didn't discount possibility. These young men had made terrible choices, but they weren't defined solely by those choices unless they surrendered to that definition. As they left, Jackson lingered behind. My brother, he said quietly. You were right about the anger. It's been running everything since he died, but sitting with that anger every day, it's exhausting. I'm tired of being this angry. Anger isn't wrong, Marcus replied. It's a normal response to loss and injustice. The question is what you do with it. Do you let it consume you, or do you transform it into motivation for becoming someone your brother would be proud of? Jackson's eyes glistened slightly. You think he'd be proud of me now? I think he'd be proud of you trying to become something more than what hurt you both, Marcus said gently. That's harder than staying angry. After Jackson left, Marcus sat alone in the quiet library, surrounded by books and the weight of small transformations beginning to accumulate. He thought about the invisible architecture of change, how it emerged not through grand gestures, but through patient, consistent presence. How wisdom without power couldn't force transformation, but power without wisdom guaranteed destruction. He was building something here, though he couldn't yet articulate exactly what. Not therapy, not counseling, not friendship exactly. Something else. A practice of witnessed humanity that acknowledged the worst of what people had done, while refusing to define them solely by it. The work was exhausting, precarious, and completely unsanctioned. It was also the most meaningful thing Marcus had done in years. When systems collide, every fragile piece eventually faces its crisis. When institutional authority and underground influence clash, where does true wisdom stand? The confrontation ahead will test everything built so far. Subscribe now. You won't want to miss this crucial turning point in Marcus's journey. The crisis Marcus had anticipated arrived during his 4th month at Riverside, triggered by forces beyond the prison's walls. The state legislature passed new sentencing guidelines that dramatically reduced parole eligibility for violent offenders, effectively extending hundreds of current inmates' sentences by years or decades. The announcement hit Riverside like a bomb, detonating carefully maintained equilibrium overnight. Within 24 hours, the tension was palpable. Inmates who'd been counting days toward release hearings suddenly faced indefinite extensions. The emotional impact was devastating, hope systematically destroyed by legislative stroke. Marcus watched men who'd been making genuine progress toward rehabilitation collapse into despair or rage. The administration's response was characteristically bureaucratic. Increased security protocols, restricted movement, mandatory cell time. They locked down problems rather than addressing underlying human impacts. The measures accelerated the institutional pressure rather than relieving it. On the 3rd day after the announcement, violence erupted. A fight in the dining hall escalated into a full-scale riot involving 30 inmates across multiple factions. Guards deployed pepper spray and tactical teams, but the damage was done. 3 inmates seriously injured, 1 guard hospitalized, and the entire facility placed on emergency lockdown. Marcus watched from the administrative wing where he'd been cleaning when the riot started. Through reinforced windows, he saw the aftermath. Inmates herded into cells, debris scattered across the dining hall, the unmistakable marks of institutional violence that would leave psychological scars long after physical injuries healed. Lockdown meant his cleaning work was suspended. Marcus was escorted to a staff holding area to wait out the emergency protocols. There he found Sarah Mitchell, exhausted and troubled. "This was predictable," she said, slumping into a chair. "We knew this legislation was coming, knew the impact it would have, and administration did nothing to prepare for the emotional fallout." "They don't have tools for emotional fallout," Marcus observed. "They have tools for security and control. Those tools are necessary but insufficient." "So what would you have done?" Mitchell asked, genuine curiosity beneath the frustration. Marcus considered the question carefully. "I would have acknowledged the impact honestly. Brought people together in small groups before the announcement. Let them process the reality rather than pretending it wasn't devastating. Helped them distinguish between hopelessness and genuine strategic options they still possess. Given them language for what they're feeling and pathways for channeling it productively." "That sounds like therapy." "That sounds like leadership," Marcus corrected. "Helping people navigate catastrophic news is leadership, whether you're a warden, a manager, or a janitor." Mitchell studied him for a long moment. "The inmates listen to you. Not officially, not in groups, but individually. I've watched it happen. You have influence here that administration doesn't even recognize exists." "Influence isn't authority," Marcus said. "No, but sometimes it's more effective," Mitchell replied. "What if I could arrange for you to address the population when lockdown lifts? Not as a psychologist, not as therapy, but as a community meeting where someone, anyone, acknowledges what they're experiencing." Marcus felt the weight of that proposal. It would expose his role completely, making visible what had operated in shadows. The administration would have to acknowledge his influence or explicitly prohibit it. Either outcome would fundamentally change his position. "That's risky for both of us," Marcus said finally. "This whole facility is at risk right now," Mitchell countered. "We've had one riot. Without intervention, we'll have more. You've been preventing violence for months through individual conversations. Maybe it's time to scale up." Marcus recognized the logic even as he felt the danger. But Mitchell was right. Individual interventions couldn't address institutional crisis. Either his approach could expand to meet the moment, or it would be overwhelmed by it. "Set up the meeting," Marcus agreed. "But I'll need support from the Shadow Council first. If Julius, Prophet, and Vincent don't endorse this, it won't work." Mitchell nodded. "Can you reach them during lockdown?" "I can send word through the guards they've cultivated. It'll get to them." The message Marcus sent was simple. Need to address the population about the sentencing changes. Need your visible support. This either stabilizes the facility or destabilizes everything. What do you want? The response came back through Officer Harris, who Julius had maintained a relationship with for years. Council meets at midnight in maintenance. Be there. Midnight meetings violated every prison protocol, but some things happened beyond official rules. Marcus arrived at the maintenance closet to find not just Julius, Prophet, and Vincent, but 6 other influential inmates, representatives from major factions who'd been brought together for crisis consultation. "You want to give a speech," Julius said without preamble. "During community meeting tomorrow when lockdown lifts. Tell us why we should support that." Marcus addressed the assembled group with the same directness. "The sentencing changes have destabilized everything. People are desperate, angry, and feeling betrayed. That emotional state drives violence, which drives lockdown, which drives more anger. It's a cycle that ends badly for everyone. What I'm proposing is honest acknowledgement of what everyone's feeling, combined with strategic discussion of what options actually remain. Not false hope, but real assessment." "And you think that stops more riots?" one of the faction representatives challenged. "I think it gives people language for what they're experiencing and reminds them they're not alone in it," Marcus replied. "Isolation amplifies despair. Community can absorb it and distribute the weight." Prophet spoke thoughtfully. "What you're describing is essentially group therapy without calling it that. What I'm describing is what communities have always done when facing collective trauma," Marcus said. "Gather, acknowledge, and find paths forward together. That's not therapy. That's human survival." The inmates exchanged glances, calculating risks and benefits. Finally, Julius spoke. "We support this. But understand, if this goes wrong, if you make things worse instead of better, you're on your own. We can't protect you from backlash if this fails." "I understand," Marcus agreed. "One more thing," Vincent added. "You address the population. You're stepping fully into the open. Administration will have to acknowledge you or shut you down. Either way, your quiet influence ends. You ready for that?" Marcus felt the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. Everything he'd built over 4 months, the careful conversations, the subtle interventions, the gradual trust, would be exposed to institutional scrutiny. But Mitchell was right. The moment demanded response that exceeded individual conversations. "I'm ready," Marcus said. As he returned to the staff holding area, Marcus felt both trepidation and clarity. Tomorrow would determine whether his approach could scale from individual relationships to institutional intervention, or whether the exposure would destroy the fragile ecosystem he'd been cultivating. Either way, there was no turning back now. The quiet janitor was about to become something else entirely, and neither he nor the institution would remain unchanged by what followed. Speaking truth to captives. When a janitor stands before hundreds of hardened criminals to address collective despair, every word carries weight of lives balanced on edge. What happens when wisdom meets rage, when honesty confronts hopelessness? This moment reveals what true courage looks like. You won't want to miss how this unfolds. Make sure you're subscribed. The community meeting assembled in the main gymnasium, a cavernous space that typically hosted basketball and exercise but now held 400 inmates seated on bleachers and floor. The administration had reluctantly agreed to Mitchell's proposal for a community dialogue session, though they clearly expected it to be a pro forma address by the warden about maintaining order. Instead, Warden Patricia Thornton introduced Marcus Webb, describing him simply as a long-term staff member who many of you have encountered during his work here. The description was deliberately vague, acknowledging Marcus's presence without explaining his influence. The inmates knew better. Marcus stood at center court, no podium, no microphone, just him and 400 men carrying rage, despair, and the crushing weight of extended sentences. He wore his janitor's uniform still, carrying his identity honestly rather than claiming false authority. The gymnasium was eerily quiet. Julius, Prophet, and Vincent sat prominently in the front rows, their visible attendance signaling institutional support from the Shadow Council. But support was conditional. One misstep, and Marcus would be alone in a very dangerous space. "I'm not going to tell you the sentencing changes are fair," Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly in the acoustic space. "I'm not going to suggest you should accept them without anger. I'm not going to pretend this isn't devastating." The directness landed powerfully. Men who'd expected platitudes or dismissal leaned forward slightly, surprised by honest acknowledgement. "What I am going to do," Marcus continued, "is name what I think many of you are feeling right now, so you know you're not alone in it. And then we're going to talk about what actual options exist. Not fantasy options, not false hope, but real strategies for navigating this reality." He paused, letting the promise settle before proceeding. "First, the feelings. You're angry. At the legislature, at a system that keeps changing rules, at everyone who promised rehabilitation mattered and then extended your sentences anyway. That anger is completely legitimate. You're also scared, though many of you won't admit it. Scared that the life you're trying to build outside these walls keeps receding further into impossible distance. You're exhausted from maintaining hope against constant defeats, and some of you are surrendering to despair, deciding if the system won't give you hope, you'll stop trying." The gymnasium remained absolutely silent, but Marcus felt the recognition rippling through the assembled men. He was naming their private experiences publicly, transforming isolation into shared reality. "Here's what I know about human beings," Marcus said. "We're incredibly resilient when we have purpose and connection. We collapse when we feel powerless and alone. Right now, these sentencing changes are designed to make you feel powerless. The question is whether you'll accept that definition of yourselves." "Easy to say from your side," someone called from the bleachers. "You go home every night." "You're right," Marcus acknowledged immediately. "I do go home. My freedom isn't conditional, but my understanding of suffering isn't theoretical. I've spent 27 years listening to people describe their worst experiences and watching them either surrender to those experiences or transcend them. That's not the same as living it, but it's not ignorance either." He let that acknowledgement stand before continuing. "So let's talk about real options. First option, you can give up. Stop participating in programs, embrace bitterness, make your remaining time as miserable as possible. That's actually an option, and I won't pretend it isn't. But understand what you're choosing. Not just extended physical time here, but extended psychological imprisonment that won't end even when you're eventually released." Several inmates shifted uncomfortably, recognizing themselves in that description. "Second option, you can rage. Fight the system, fight each other, fight the guards. Create enough chaos that maybe something changes. But understand that chaos in prison leads to lockdown, which leads to reduced privileges, which makes everything worse. The system always has more capacity for control than you have for resistance through violence." Marcus saw Julius nod slightly, an acknowledgement of strategic reality that gang leaders understood intimately. "Third option," Marcus continued, his voice intensifying. "You can refuse to let these changes define the entirety of your experience. You can acknowledge they're devastating while simultaneously continuing to build whatever version of yourself you want to become. You can use the additional time, which you didn't choose and isn't fair, to develop skills, strengthen relationships with people who matter, and prepare psychologically for eventual release even if it's further away than you hoped." "That sounds like accepting defeat," another voice challenged. "No," Marcus said firmly. "That sounds like refusing to let circumstances destroy your agency. Acceptance isn't the same as surrender. Acceptance is saying, this is the reality I'm facing. Now what am I going to do with the time and resources I actually have?" He walked slowly across the gymnasium floor, making eye contact with different sections of the audience. "I've watched some of you these past 4 months," Marcus said. "I've seen Jackson Riley go from fighting everything to actually preparing for his GED. I've seen Anthony Santos, who almost got beaten over false accusations, start mentoring new inmates about commissary scams. I've seen dozens of small transformations. People choosing to become more than their worst moments." Jackson sat in the bleachers, his expression carefully neutral, but his attention absolute. "Those transformations didn't happen because circumstances were perfect," Marcus continued. "They happened because individuals decided their circumstances wouldn't have final authority over who they became. That same choice exists now, even with extended sentences. Maybe especially with extended sentences, because you have more time to become someone radically different than who you were when you arrived." Prophet stood, drawing all attention. "You're asking a lot. You're asking people to maintain hope when the system keeps proving hope is foolish." I'm not asking for naive hope, Marcus replied, addressing Prophet directly. I'm asking for strategic hope, the recognition that becoming a better version of yourself serves your interests regardless of external circumstances. When you eventually leave here, do you want to leave as someone destroyed by bitterness or someone refined by adversity? The question hung in the air. I'm also offering something else, Marcus added. I'm offering to expand what I've been doing individually. I'll meet with anyone who wants to talk through their specific situation, their actual options, their realistic pathways forward. Not therapy. I'm not licensed for that. But consultation about how to use your time strategically rather than just surviving it. The warden shifted uncomfortably, recognizing this was beyond what she'd authorized. But she didn't interrupt. This community, Marcus said, sweeping his arm to encompass the assembled inmates, has its own power structures and leadership. I respect those structures. Julius, Prophet, Vincent, and others. They maintain the actual peace here more effectively than any administrative policy. What I'm proposing is collaboration between their leadership and my particular understanding of psychological processes. Together, maybe we create something unusual, a prison environment where people actually use their time productively. Julius stood now as well. The doc, he caught himself. Marcus here has been working with us unofficially. His interventions have prevented violence, helped stabilize situations that could have gone bad. What he's proposing is making official what's been happening in shadows. We support that. But it requires everyone here to participate honestly. No gaming the system, no using his access to settle scores or manipulate situations. The gymnasium buzzed with conversation as inmates absorbed this unprecedented collaboration between shadow leadership and institutional staff. Marcus held up his hand for quiet. Last thing. The anger you're feeling about these sentencing changes, it's legitimate. But anger without direction is just destruction. If you want to channel that anger productively, work with legal advocates, write to legislators, participate in restorative justice programs that demonstrate rehabilitation actually works. Make them regret these changes by proving their assumptions about you are wrong. He paused, letting the challenge settle. Or stay angry, get violent, prove their assumptions right, and guarantee they'll never reform these policies. Your choice. The meeting ended with uncertainty rather than resolution. No applause, no clear consensus, but also no violence. Men filed out slowly, many in animated discussion. Some approached Marcus directly, requesting the individual consultations he'd offered. Others remained skeptical, arms crossed against possibilities. As the gymnasium emptied, Warden Thornton approached Marcus. That was highly irregular. Yes, ma'am, Marcus agreed. Also possibly the most effective intervention I've seen in 20 years of corrections work, she admitted. You're operating in a gray zone I can't officially authorize, but I'm not going to prohibit either. Just understand, if this goes wrong, I can't protect you. I understand. Mitchell joined them, smiling slightly. Welcome to visibility, Marcus. No more quiet janitor. Marcus looked around the empty gymnasium, feeling the weight of what he'd initiated. 400 men now knew explicitly what he'd been doing implicitly. The institution had seen behind the curtain. Whatever came next would either validate his approach or destroy it completely. No more quiet janitor, he agreed. Now we find out if wisdom can actually reshape institutions, or if institutions are too rigid to change. Either way, Prophet said, appearing beside them. You've given people something we haven't had in years, honest acknowledgement and genuine options. That matters, regardless of what comes next. Marcus nodded, accepting the recognition while understanding the work was just beginning. He'd crossed the threshold from individual influence to institutional presence. The real test would be whether that presence could sustain itself against the inevitable pressures that would emerge. The architecture of transformation. Every journey reveals its meaning only in reflection, when individual moments coalesce into patterns of profound change. Watch as months of quiet work culminate in an institution fundamentally transformed, not through force, but through patient wisdom and witnessed humanity. This conclusion illuminates truths about courage, change, and the human capacity for redemption. If this story moved you, subscribe to continue exploring narratives of unexpected transformation. 6 months after the community meeting, Riverside Correctional Facility had become something unprecedented in the state's prison system. The changes were subtle enough that official reports simply noted significant reduction in disciplinary incidents and improved program participation. But those living and working within the facility understood that something more profound had occurred. Martinez, Marcus recalled. Carlos Martinez, 28, serving 12 for robbery and assault. Previous facility reports indicate he's strategic rather than impulsive. He's testing boundaries deliberately to assess resistance. So, how do we address it? Julius asked. Marcus thought for a moment. Let me talk to him first. If he's strategic, he might respond to clear articulation of consequences and alternatives. If that doesn't work, then you handle it through established channels. But let's try the non-violent option first. Vincent smiled slightly. 6 months ago, we would have shut him down immediately through force. Now we're consulting with the janitor about psychological intervention. Strange world. Effective world, Julius corrected. Disciplinary incidents are down 40% since Marcus started working openly. That's fewer lockdowns, more access to programs, better environment for everyone. I'm not sentimental about it. This is purely strategic. His approach works better than traditional enforcement. Marcus found Carlos Martinez in the recreation yard the next day, working out with aggressive intensity that telegraphed barely contained violence. Marcus approached slowly, maintaining respectful distance. Carlos Martinez, he said calmly. Can we talk? Martinez stopped mid-exercise, his expression hostile. Who the hell are you? Marcus Webb. I'm the janitor, also someone who pays attention to what happens in this facility. I've been hearing your name recently. Then you know I don't take orders from janitors. I'm not giving orders, Marcus replied evenly. I'm offering perspective. You're new here, trying to establish position. That's normal. But you're going about it in ways that will trigger responses you probably don't want. I'm suggesting more effective strategies. Martinez laughed mockingly. The old man's going to teach me prison politics? No, Marcus said. The man who's watched hundreds of people try exactly what you're trying is going to tell you why most of them failed, and what the few who succeeded did differently. Something in Marcus's tone, the absence of fear or condescension, made Martinez pause. You've got 5 minutes. You're testing boundaries with distribution networks, Marcus began. You're doing it aggressively to establish dominance quickly. But the people who run those networks have been here for years, have relationships with guards, and have demonstrated they can make problems disappear quietly. If you push them, they won't fight you publicly. They'll orchestrate situations that result in you catching infractions, losing privileges, or getting transferred to worse facilities. Martinez's expression hardened. So I should just accept their control. I'm saying there are strategic ways to establish yourself that don't require direct confrontation, Marcus replied. Provide value they need, build relationships with key influencers, demonstrate reliability over time. Power in prison isn't just about intimidation. It's about becoming indispensable to systems people depend on. And you're going to help me with that? Martinez asked skeptically. I'm going to suggest you have a conversation with Prophet Washington, who mediates disputes and has no particular interest in distribution networks. He can help you understand actual opportunities for advancement that don't require war. Martinez studied Marcus for a long moment. Why do you care what happens to me? Because violence here affects everyone, Marcus said simply, including people just trying to do their time and prepare for release. I'd prefer we maintain the relative peace we've built, rather than descend back into chaos. The conversation ended without commitment, but Marcus had planted the seed. What Martinez did with it would reveal whether he was genuinely strategic or simply violent. 2 days later, Marcus heard from Prophet that Martinez had requested a meeting. The intervention had worked, not completely, but enough to shift Martinez's trajectory from collision toward negotiation. These small victories accumulated. Not every intervention succeeded, not every person transformed, but the aggregate impact was undeniable. Riverside was functioning differently, operating with less overt violence and more genuine rehabilitation focus than state corrections typically managed. Marcus found Jackson in the library one evening, working through welding certification materials with focused intensity. But when he noticed Marcus, Jackson set aside his books. "Can I ask you something?" Jackson said. "Of course. Why did you really take this job? I know about the license suspension. Know you couldn't practice officially. But you could have worked anywhere. Why come back to prison as a janitor?" Marcus's office, if it could be called that, occupied a converted storage room near the library. He still officially worked as a janitor, still cleaned floors and emptied trash, but his cleaning cart now made strategic stops throughout the facility where inmates knew they could find him for consultations. The administration had tacitly acknowledged this dual role without formally authorizing it, maintaining institutional deniability while benefiting from the results. The consultations varied widely. Sometimes inmates sought help understanding their legal options or navigating parole preparation. Sometimes they needed to talk through family conflicts or discuss strategies for managing anger. Sometimes they simply needed someone to acknowledge their existence with careful attention rather than institutional efficiency. Marcus never provided therapy. That boundary remained clear. But he offered perspective, asked clarifying questions, and helped people see patterns in their own behavior they'd previously missed. The work exhausted him, but it was the kind of exhaustion that came from meaningful purpose rather than futile effort. Jackson Riley sat across from Marcus on a Tuesday afternoon, holding his completed GED certificate with visible pride. At 24, he'd transformed from the violent, angry young man who'd arrived 8 months earlier into someone recognizably different, still intense, still carrying pain, but no longer defined by it. "I got accepted to the vocational welding program," Jackson said. "Starts next month, and my parole officer says if I complete it without incidents, I'm good for hearing review in 18 months. "That's excellent work," Marcus said, genuine pleasure in his voice. "Your brother would be proud." Jackson's expression flickered. The mention still hurt, but differently now. Maybe. Or maybe he'd wonder why it took me so long to figure out that destroying myself wasn't honoring him. "Transformation usually takes time," Marcus observed. "Quick changes rarely last. You're building something sustainable." After Jackson left, Marcus sat in the quiet storage room reviewing his informal records, not official files, but his own notes tracking the individuals he'd been working with. 47 inmates currently engaged in regular consultations. 17 had completed educational programs. 8 had reconciled with estranged family members. 3 had successfully challenged aspects of their sentencing through legal channels Marcus helped them understand. The numbers were small against a population of 800, but each number represented someone who'd chosen to use their imprisonment as transformation, rather than just punishment. Each number was a life potentially redirected. Sarah Mitchell appeared in the doorway, carrying coffee, a ritual that had developed over the months. They'd become unofficial collaborators, her institutional knowledge complementing his psychological understanding. "You're not going to believe this," Mitchell said, settling into the second chair. "Administration is discussing formalizing your position, actually creating a role for you that acknowledges what you're doing." Marcus looked up, surprised. "That's complicated?" "Very. Some people argue you should be reinstated as staff psychologist. Others say that's impossible given the license suspension, and that we should create something new, peer support specialist or community liaison. There's genuine disagreement about whether what you do fits existing frameworks." "What do you think?" Marcus asked. Mitchell considered carefully. "I think frameworks are often the problem. You're effective precisely because you operate between official roles, maintaining access and flexibility that formal positions would constrain. If they formalize you, they'll inevitably try to standardize what you do, which might destroy what makes it work." Marcus nodded slowly, recognizing the dilemma. "So I stay in gray zones, hoping administration continues tolerating what they can't officially authorize." "For now," Mitchell agreed. "But gray zones are inherently unstable. Eventually something will force clarification, either positive recognition or prohibition." That evening, Marcus attended what had become weekly meetings with the Shadow Council. These gatherings had evolved from crisis consultations into strategic planning sessions about facility management. Julius, Prophet, Vincent, and rotating faction representatives collaborated with Marcus to identify potential conflicts early and address them before they escalated. "We've got a problem developing in D Block," Prophet reported. "New transfer named Martinez is making noise about taking over distribution networks. He's aggressive and doesn't respect established boundaries. Marcus settled into a chair, considering the question seriously. Because therapy offices create artificial boundaries that sometimes prevent real connection. When someone sits across from you, knowing you're the psychologist, they perform a version of themselves shaped by that awareness. As a janitor, I'm just present in their actual environment, seeing how they navigate daily reality, rather than how they present in controlled sessions. But you lost status, lost authority, lost the professional identity you'd built for decades. I did, Marcus acknowledged, but I gained something else. The ability to be genuinely present without institutional barriers. And I learned that sometimes losing status is necessary to gain real influence. Jackson absorbed this thoughtfully. You know what you actually are? You're like a teacher who pretends to be a student to understand how the school really works. You gave up being on top to see everything from ground level. Marcus smiled at the perceptive analysis. That's actually quite accurate, though I didn't plan it that way initially. I took this job because I needed employment and knew the environment. But once I was here, I discovered possibilities I hadn't anticipated. Well, whatever you call it, Jackson said seriously. It saved my life. I was on a path that ended badly. More violence, more time, eventual destruction. You gave me a different possibility. A lot of people in here would say the same thing. The gratitude was uncomfortable for Marcus, who'd never sought recognition. But he accepted it gracefully, understanding Jackson needed to express what Marcus's presence had meant. As Marcus walked home that evening, he'd long since stopped driving, preferring the contemplative space of walking. He reflected on the unexpected architecture of transformation he'd helped construct. Not through grand gestures or institutional authority, but through patient, consistent presence. Through seeing people fully rather than reducing them to their crimes. Through offering perspective without demanding change, creating space for growth without forcing it. The work wasn't finished, and never would be. Prisons would continue receiving angry, broken people. Systems would continue failing to address underlying causes of crime. Legislation would continue prioritizing punishment over rehabilitation. But within those constraints, small spaces of genuine transformation were possible when someone paid attention, offered wisdom, and refused to surrender hope in human capacity for change. Marcus thought about his former career. The prestigious position, the professional respect, the comfortable certainty of official authority. He'd lost all of that, but he'd gained something perhaps more valuable. The knowledge that true influence emerged not from titles or credentials, but from character, wisdom, and willingness to be present where others overlooked. He was still a janitor, still cleaned floors and emptied trash, but he was also something else entirely. A witness to human resilience, a cultivator of possibilities, a reminder that wisdom could emerge from unexpected places and that transformation often required losing everything you thought mattered to discover what actually does. The work continued. The work would always continue. But now Marcus understood that sometimes the greatest achievements came not from climbing hierarchies, but from choosing to descend into forgotten spaces and discovering what could grow there, when tended with patience, respect, and unshakable belief in human potential for redemption. They had laughed at the janitor in prison. They weren't laughing anymore. They were listening. And that, Marcus had learned, made all the difference. Thank you for journeying with Marcus through this story of unexpected transformation. If this narrative resonated with you, consider how wisdom and patient presence might transform environments you inhabit. True change rarely comes from force or authority. It emerges from consistent, principled action that acknowledges human dignity even in broken systems. Subscribe for more stories exploring resilience, courage, and the transformative power of witnessed humanity. Tentar novamente.